Hello guys, I hope you're good. In today's video, I'm just gonna go through um, what we went through in our last auditing session, just to refresh on how you should answer questions in terms of like auditing. So when I looked at your guys' scope for the test, I saw that they only did the cycles. So based on my experience, like they don't really test only cycles. They are gonna also put like in some topics there. So I'm just gonna also cover like the frameworks for like those topics, basically how to approach those topics. Okay. So I'm gonna start with ethics and corporate governance. So be yeah. So in ethics and corporate governance, um, the types of questions that you'll get is something like this. So it's something like this, right? So in this type of question, what happens? They basically telling you to evaluate using King, right? So basically, this type of question is a type basically like when they tell you to evaluate using King, now what they're asking you basically is to get like the consents. So you see what they have here, consents. So that's the main thing that you're looking at, the issues, right? So the problem with like the way they apply their practice, right? So let me show you then an example. So what I mean is that these types of questions are the same, even though they say evaluate using corporate governance. It's the same as the question says, saying what are the concerns in terms of like King. So it's the same question. So in this type of question, what you should have, number one, is your list of recommended practices, right? So obviously you do have your King report, right? However, that document like is long, like I said when I was busy in that class. So like I said, I said you should go to like basically solutions of like questions. Obviously, right now it's late. You can't do it right now, but you had to come to these solutions, right? And then write down the recommended practices, right? Like for instance, this one, King 4 recommends that a governing body should comprise of majority. You see, this is the list that you should have had, right? And then after you have this list, basically this list of recommendations, right? You see this list of recommendations. What you're gonna do is you're gonna read it over and over again so that it's easy for you to identify the issues while you're in the scenario. Because let me show you when you go to the scenario what I'm talking about, right? So okay, so here there's no really concerns about King. So I'm just gonna go to this part of the scenario, right? So the first thing they tell us about they give us the picture of the board structure from left to right, right? So if you knew the recommended practice of King, number one, of that they should be like a diversity, right? You see these are all like white males, right? So there's no diversity. So if you knew that recommendation that there should be like diversity among the board, then it would have been easy for you to have seen that this thing is an issue. So what I mean is that these recommended practices, like in the King report that you have, like the textbook or like the standard, like it lists basically a lot of recommended practices, right? However, they're not going to test you on all. So that's why I suggested that you just come here and look at the recommended practices, right? And as you can see, this side, the concerns, what is a concern? A concern is when they don't basically follow that recommended practice. So it's as simple as just knowing the recommended practice and then seeing that they don't follow the recommended practice, right? Don't worry for like exams or for the next test, like the fifth test. I didn't really have much time for editing, but I'm gonna compile a list of all of like these recommendations and like basically these lists that I was telling you guys to like do. I'll also like do for you a comprehensive list, but the thing is I didn't really have the time. Um, so yeah, for the next test, definitely. However, like I said, you should have like a list with all of these things because once like it's ingrained in you, then it will be easy for you to identify the issues because as you're reading the scenario, every single point here, you have to ask yourself like in those lists that you have basically. Ne? So these lists, I call them recommended practices, right? Because that's the recommendation in that standard. So um you'll see as you are reading every sentence you read, you have to just see if that's a risk, right? And it's a risk if it doesn't abide with a certain like recommended practice, right? So that recommended practice is that list that I was telling you about, the list of what is recommended, right? So in King, It's called recommended practices. So that's the list that you had to compile for like King. And then after you have that list, right, in a test, what you're gonna do is you're just gonna read the scenario, and then you are gonna highlight basically all the issues that you have based on your list of recommended practices, right? And then you should see you should be able to obtain basically all the marks there. And then if basically you cannot obtain like, or while you're in the scenario, you didn't see like a lot of points, then you can go back to that list and then see if like you've left out something that's in the scenario, right? But that list is, like I said, is crucial because you should know the recommended practice. And then once you know the recommended practice, it's going to be easy for you to identify in the scenario when something does not abide by the recommended practice, right? So that's basically King, like in like how to do like corporate governance, applying King, right? And then I also suggest you guys go through. Um, I did put in here reportable irregularity. So I suggest you guys go through like the solution of reportable irregularity, just to see like what elements should be put into that, like answering like a question asking you about reportable irregularity, right? It's going to be in most cases like a 5 mark question. It won't be a long question. However, like what I've seen is that it's not really like a hard question. So if you know these elements, like it will be okay. And then um we go to ethics. So every question that asks you to do like ethics, ne, in most cases, it will require you to answer that ethical question using the CPC, right? So using the CPC, and most like if I'll be like more specific, part one of the CPC, so the fundamental principles. So seeing whether something is a threat, like self-interest threat, or to the fundamental principles like objectivity, integrity, independence. So you use like CPC in most cases for like ethics questions, right? And like I said, I'm like, because we don't have like the question paper for last year, I'm not really sure like how they're gonna ask it or to what scale. That's why I suggest, obviously, if you have this list, to read this list of like recommended practices. Then if you do not, just read um like one part of the, so this, maybe I'll take this solution and then just skim through these like recommended practices, right? Because they should cover like most. Yeah, they should cover most. If you didn't do that list, that's what I recommend. Just read through that part of recommended practices. You don't need to read through this part, right? Because that's basically what's gonna be in the scenario, right? Now, how do you do ethics and corporate governance, right? Like I said, you'll have that list, and then as you are reading, you identify the issue, right, or the trigger, right? And the trigger, like I said here, it's in the scenario. So everything that I said trigger here, if I wrote the word trigger, you must just know that it must be in the scenario. So it's something that's been said in the scenario that basically um, triggered you to think of that practice in that list, right? However, like a trigger is like something in the scenario, right? So you'll see as you're reading the scenario, like here, um, let me just go to this question. Like in this question, the first trigger here is that this is a picture of the board structure, right? So this in itself is a trigger because this is an issue, right? So as I said, here is an issue. Why? Because it doesn't go according to the recommended practices, right? Yeah. So that's what I meant here. But like I said, for the next test, I will be done with these lists. So I'll give you guys these lists, and then we can move on to pre-engagement activities. So that's ethics. So with regards to pre-engagement activities, this one in terms of the framework, it's already like given to you. There's really not much for me there to explain really, other than like you should like follow basically like this pattern, right? So basically assess firstly if the client is new, the independence and ethical considerations of the client, right? According to the CPC and APA. And as you can see here, I wrote recommended practice here, right? So even this like ethical considerations, right? You will see that they are in the CPC and APA. And like I said, these things like are long, right? So I don't suggest you get these recommended practices from these like standards, I suggest you get them like from like solutions, right? So as you come here, so as you are here, right, you're gonna see the problem like here with independence and what section they used, right? And then there will be the most probable like focal area that they're gonna use, right? And then in terms of like CPC, do not forget like firstly that thing of getting firstly the threat, what fundamental principle that threat affects, right? Whether the threat is significant or not, right? Yeah, don't forget those things, right? So basically what I'm covering here is just the layout of how like these questions are going to look, not the question itself, because like I said, I'm not really sure about the scope, so I'm just trying to cover an array of things. So here the same thing would have, like the same thing that applied here would have done here. So like I said, I would have like a list like of things that you have to check out, especially like of risks that you have to check out, right, in these recommended practices, right? However, like I said, these are things that like I already like showed you that like you should have like already got, right? Like for example here, independence of audit, right? Long-term relationship with client, right? So do you see that this, so basically according to the psycha professional code of conduct, the recommended practice is what? According to the psycha professional code of conduct, the recommended practice is that you must not have long-term relationship with the audit client, right? Then what is the definition of a long-term relationship? It depends, right? Who are you, right? But for a partner, like normal an engagement partner, I know it to be 9 years, right? But it depends. Do you see here it's 10 years, right? And then that is obviously a familiarity threat, right? That's so basically what I meant is that this is the recommended practice, right? That there shouldn't be long-term relationships, and then you should define what that practice is. What does it entail? So it is 10 years. So 10 years is a long-term relationship. And then also the recommended practice, the reason for it, why doesn't it allow more than 9 years? Because a familiarity threat, right, arises out of it, right? And what does it affect? What fundamental principles does it affect? Independence, objectivity, integrity, and competence. I guess this is a threat, and these are fundamental principles, right? And then this is basically further explaining, right? This is now explaining the result of the threat, right? That this threat, this is the result of what the threat like might do, the impact of the threat, right? Because a threat basically is a risk. So this is the impact of the threat, the risk, right? This, so she might be inclined to overlook misstatements, right? And then so because she might be inclined to look at misstatements here, like you can say it's significant, right? And if it's significant, it means that we have to put in a safeguard, right? And a possible safeguard is basically a control. So when you're looking at like psycha code of conduct, basically threats mean risks, so about, and then safeguards are like controls, because safeguards are like tools that we use to mitigate risks, which are controls. Then do you see safeguard could be to rather appoint another engagement partner to conduct the audit. Do you see this is like the control, right? So this is the main thing that like you should, so basically in that like scenario when you are reading, it should have like hinted to you when they said like this partner has been like has been the external engagement provider for 10 years, right? Because you know that according to the recommended practice, right, for an external audit to be independent, it should be not more than 9 years, right? Yeah. So that's basically what I meant. And then here, this is another recommended practice, right? Right? Yeah. Yeah. Because like self-review threat, right? Yeah. So that's what I was talking about. You should basically look at like the recommended practices. So long-term relationship with audit client number one are not allowed. Self-reviewing is not allowed, right? So those are the recommended practices. That's what I mean by a recommended practice. But like I said, I'll give you a list of like them later on, because yeah, this thing it's gonna take a bit of time to compile. Yeah. So for every section, that's what you basically do, even for integrity of client, right? And then obviously, if you've done like enough of these questions, you'll see that once you have like a point there, a recommended practice, right? You'll see that the next question will just add to it, or it will just show you that like they are repetitive, these things. Yeah. So that's basically for pre-engagement like activities, right? That's basically pre-engagement activities. Yeah. And then I think we can move on to computers, right? So okay, so for computers, basically the questions that I've seen here in this question bank mainly deal with like identifying the weakness of the general control environment, right? So they are mainly to do with the weakness of the general control environment, right? So um, how do you do this? So basically for computers, like that third module, it looks at basically weaknesses on general controls, right? Yeah. So how do you approach a question like that? So firstly, like I said, you see auditing, like I said, those lists are very important. Those recommended practices are very important. So the first thing you need here is the recommended IT general controls practice, right? Because you won't know whether or not they made a weakness, like a weakness or not, if you don't know what type of control should be there. Because a weakness in a control is basically what should have been there, right? So for you to identify a weakness, you firstly have to see that this is a control and this is how the control should have been. So let me give you an example. So in this case, let's just look at one solution here, right? So do you see they say okay, let's look at this one. The overall responsibility of IT is not with the board and is delegated to the head of IT, right? Right. So why is this a weakness? Because as per King, the overall responsibility of the IT department lies with the board, right? Now, this in this question they said explanation, right? Provide an explanation like for each weakness. When they say explanation for weakness, what they mean is that you should provide the impact of the weakness, right? You should provide the impact of the weakness. So in this question, they were not really accurate by putting this thing here because this is not the impact of the weakness. This is the recommended practice. This is the reason why this one was put here, right? So this is what you basically have to write in the recommended practice, that the overall responsibility of the IT department lies with the board. Let's just go to another one. So the head of IT is a pastry chef and it appears that she does not have the necessary skills and competence, right? So what is the recommended practice is that the head of IT must have the necessary skills and competence, right? Right. So that's the recommended practice. Now, what's the impact of that weakness? If you don't have a head of IT that does not have the necessary skills and competence, what's the impact of that risk? This could result in ineffective computerized controls and process, therefore errors and irregularities, right? So that's basically explaining the impact of this weakness, right? Yeah. So that's what I meant here. So the first thing is you have to have your recommended practice, right? So in this type of questions, how do you get them? Like I showed you just here. The next one, changes made to the system without proper procedures, authorization, or review. So, what is the recommended practice? The changes made to the system must be made with proper, right, procedures, authorization, and review. So that's the recommended practice. And then what's the weakness? The weakness is that what is a weakness? Like I said here, a weakness which is a trigger, right? And a trigger, I said, is something in the scenario. So a weakness is something that is in the scenario, right? Which is a control. A control that's not that's in the scenario, right? So the control that's in the scenario, however, it's not in accordance with what the recommended practice. So what they told us they that the head of IT is a pastry chef, right? So that was what was in the scenario, right? The trigger, right? Now let's just see if this thing is a weakness, right? If it's a pastry chef, right, it most probably means that like it does not have like IT skills, right? Yeah. So if this guy is a pastry chef, right? It means that it does not have like the necessary like skills necessary. And according to the IT general controls recommended practice, the head of the IT department is supposed to have the necessary skills and competence, right? That's why it's a weakness, because it's going against this recommended practice, right? And then what's the impact of the weakness, right? The impact of the weakness is that this could result in ineffective computerized controls, and then yeah, and process, and therefore errors and irregularities, right? So that's basically how you get those lists. So you have to firstly have that recommended practice list firstly, right? And then see if it's not in accordance with that recommended practice, right? Yeah. So what I suggest with this one, if you haven't done it, this one, because like it might take time, just focus on the recommended practice list, right? Because this is like the most important. So here, like I told you, with this one, you're gonna have to create it, but it's not like that difficult, because you see what should have been there. So weakness, they will tell you it's a weakness because it wasn't there. So which means it should have been there. Like the first one, the general IT environment seems to be poor due to the overall IT structure. Those charged with governance does not take responsibility for IT and delegates to the head of IT. So what does it mean? It means that for you to have a good, right, a good general IT environment, those charged with governance must take responsibility for IT and not delegate it to other basically other directors or other managers, right? And then the next one here, this one is that there is no access control to the server room, right? So there should be access control to the server room. So that's what I mean when I say a recommended practice list. But like I said, next test definitely you guys will have it. And then so that's basically computers. What I saw with computers, they basically have like general controls. So you have to know the general controls. So what is the list of what is the recommended practice here? The general controls, basically. Yeah, yeah. And then that's basically computers, right? And then can move on to the next one. So the next one is risks, right? So risks, yeah. So with risks, I think in the class I did deal with risks extensively. Yeah, I did do risks quite extensively in class, right? So yeah, I did do risks quite extensively in class. However, let me just look for the solution. Okay, so with risks, I agree it's a risk identification and assessment. So here um there's no recommended practice, but there is a list that you have to have. You have to have, like I said, the list of triggers and risks, right? The list of triggers and risks, right? And then add it will depend on the type of risk that you have, but sometimes even the impact of the risk is necessary, right? So you have to have the table of the risk, the trigger and the risk. So um yeah, let's go to one solution. So like I said, the trigger is something that's gonna be there in the in the scenario. So it is straight up in the scenario. What is in the scenario? So the trigger here is goods are important from China. However, like I said here, the triggers here, right? You have to have um um a list, right? I'll just call them standard, right? Standard triggers, right? So standard triggers, right? So you're gonna have your list of triggers. So the list of triggers is basically the triggers that you've seen before, right? And that's basically like, so that like it's easy for you to see whether or not this thing like is a risk or not, right? So let me show you guys how to create the list of standard triggers, right? So firstly is what this trigger says: goods are imported from China, right? So what is the trigger here? It's not the fact that goods are imported from China, right? It's the fact that what goods are imported, right? Do you see what this thing is the fact that goods are imported from China. It can be from China, from any other country, right? It will still work. So the trigger here, the main standard trigger, is the fact that goods are imported. So that why you wanna make sure that when you see this trigger, when you see for like goods imported, you know that this thing is a trigger, right? That's what I mean. Yeah. And then after in that table that I told you about, you're gonna have that risk, your trigger, right? And then on the side, you're gonna have its risk. So this is the risk of non-compliance with specific IFRS. This, right? That's basically the risk. And I did say for going concern, do it like alone. Don't do it like with these other risks, right? Let me go to another one. This one again, I'll use this one again as an example to show you that in some of these questions that they give you here, they might put in like triggers here, but they're actually risks. So what does it actually mean? It means that in some questions, they might give you like marks for like triggers, depending on what risk it is, especially risks to like independence and going concern. Yeah, that's what I know. Risk to going concern and independence, yeah, they do give you marks for like triggers. Also, not only risks. So what do I mean when I say they give you risks for triggers? Remember, I said triggers are things that appear exactly like in the scenario, right? So do you see that the fact that the auditor quick fix is not independent, this is not in the scenario, right? This is basically what you concluded in your risk, right? So basically let me just say that's what you concluded based on your triggers, right? That's what you concluded based on your triggers, right? So let's look at why I call these things triggers. So look at what this thing says. It says has been the audit partner since incorporation of World Sports for 10 years, right? He and Quick Fix are likely to be familiar. Okay, so this one basically, this part was in the this part, right? This part was in the scenario, right? Was in the scenario. And why does it affect independence? This one, obviously, it goes hand in hand with those recommended practice the above. Like I said, an audit partner should be like 9 years, not 10 years. So this one goes in hand with that one. That's why they say familiarity threat. But let's go to the next one. It says the scenario of WorldSport, the CEO of WorldSport CD and the audit engagement partner, right, seems to know each other on a social level, as evident from the weekend plans, right? So this is basically what was in the scenario, right? That like she's attending Tili's daughter's second birthday, right? So you can see that basically what's happening there. What is the trigger here? What is the trigger? The trigger is not the fact that um like she's going to Tili's daughter's second birthday. No, the trigger is the fact that um the engagement partner, right, is meeting TD outside, right? Outside of like a professional setting, right? So do you see what they say on a social level? So it doesn't matter what scenario you see. If you see people engaging on a social level, so going outings together, whatever, yeah, that's wrong, right? Because you only have to um communicate, right, or interact within the boundaries of the profession, not like from a personal level. That's basically the trigger. But like I said, I'll have also like a list of all of these for the next test. And then yeah, so that's basically it. So do you see most of them, these things like triggers? So even this one, do you see the engagement partner cut this vacation short to assist world sport, right? And that's not the problem here. Cutting his vacation short to assist world sport, that's not the trigger, right? Why? Because there's no issue with this. I mean, like there's no problem with this. The problem is the fact that here and indicated that CD owes him a favor. Do you see? Owes him a favor, right? So what does owes him a favor suggest, right? Obviously, from a professional setting, there's no way I can owe you a favor. Or one from a professional setting, right? So favors are basically personal by nature. So do you see that this one and this one like go hand in hand? But however, like I said, for independency, they give you marks for the trigger. So that's why you have to write both of them, right? Because they are both triggers, right? The fact that he attended the 50 and the O's part, right? Yeah. And then yeah, so basically this is also like quick fix was on was only involved in performing system conversions, right? Yeah. So because it was there for system conversion. So this one will go hand in hand with the recommended practices there above, right? Because this has to do like with independence mostly. And then what's the risk? Is that the risk that not all issues and irregularities might be identified. That's the risk. So these are the triggers. This is the risk, right? So let me just repeat that. So these are the triggers, right? Right? And as a result of these triggers, there's a risk that this auditor is not independent. And because there is that risk, right, there's a risk that not all issues and irregularities might be identified, right? Yeah. So that's basically this. And then that's basically how you do this one. So, like I said, a trigger is something that you'll find in a scenario. And when you're analyzing it, analyze its substance. Correct. Will you be able to see this thing throughout like all other scenarios? Obviously, you don't expect like every scenario for them to have birthdays, right? Sometimes they might have like a trip or whatever. So you must see like the context of it. But like I said, I'll have like the list for the next test. So this is just to go through like how you answer this thing one. Yeah, so the first thing, like I said, you have to have the trigger, and the trigger obviously you're gonna easily see it like if you have that list of like standard triggers, right? So you're gonna easily see those triggers, and then after identifying the triggers, get the risk, and then um depending on the question, in most questions they don't ask you the impact of the risk, then the impact of the risk. So um so that's just explaining the risk further. And then assessment of overall risk. That's where you just say whether it's high, low, or medium. Yeah. So there you just use like your own judgment, depending on the risk. And then yeah, so that's basically risk identification and assessment. And then we go to audit approach. So what do you do in an audit approach or response question? So when they say audit approach or response, it's the same thing. So what do you do? Firstly, you look at the impact of the risk on high risk account, right? So you'll see they'll say like give like an audit response like for something. So firstly, you wanna see like high risk accounts. So you wanna firstly identify high risk accounts, right? And then um see the impact of the risk on high risk accounts, right? And then what are sessions like? Are they likely to impact? So let me just give you an example here. Okay, let me just look for this example. Okay. Um, yeah, this is basically how you answer it. So, like I said, um impact of risk on high risk accounts, right? So here, impact on inherent risk on sales, right? So sales is the high risk account, right? So impact of inherent risk on sales. So when I say impact of risk, I meant impact of, let me just type it here, impact of type of risk, yeah, on account. Let me just put here an example. Um, mm, I, yeah, i.e. um, yeah, 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 inherent risk, yeah. So that's basically it. So impact of risk on high risk account, right? So if you want an example of that, this is it, right? And then what are sessions let me just say what are sessions is it likely to impact, right? So what are sessions is it likely to impact? So like you said here, right, that it's likely to impact what occurrence, accuracy, cutoff, and presentation, right? And then example of how it will impact its each assertion, right? So this is how you do an example of how it will impact like each assertion, right? And then the responses. So we come here. So firstly, how are you going to um, use basically substantive procedures or test of controls or the combined approach to what type of risks, right? So firstly, like I said, you can firstly divide them into those four categories. So inherent risk, control risk, um, what do you call this? Okay, detection risk is not really the presentation risk, right? And then see see how basically these um like for each like type of risk, you're going to say for inherent risks, I'm gonna use more maybe substantive procedures than test of controls. Then for control risk, I'm gonna use more of a combined approach, right? So what I can just say with substantive and test of controls, you use test of controls if you trust their internal control, right? Yeah, test of controls if you trust the internal control system, right? And then if you do not trust the internal control system, you are gonna use more of substantive testing, more specifically test of detail. And then if like you do trust them, you're gonna use more of a combined approach or a more test of controls than substantive procedures, right? So, but if you're using both of them, that's called a combined approach. Sometimes you can use substantive only if like you really don't trust their control environment. And then if you absolutely trust the control environment, you can use test of controls, right? And then also you could also structure it like this. So if you see that you have a bunch of inherent risks, right? And then one of these inherent risks, like they're not really the same as these others. So you can say inherent risk, for inherent risk, I'm gonna use more of substantive testing than test of controls. However, for this inherent risk, right? The control like environment was very good. So I'm gonna use more test of control than substantive procedures. You can also do this, right? However, I suggest you do this if you've seen it in a question before. Yeah. And then that's basically, so let me show you an example of what I mean. You see, based off my assessment of inherent risk, I will follow a full substantive approach to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, right? Look at this one, control risk, right? I would use a combined approach, right? Then presentation risk, yeah. So that's basically it, right? And then go to the last one, how the audit team, let me just see, yeah, will deploy their resources and enhance their professional skepticism, right? So like I said, this is like how they will deploy their audit team, right? They will have more staff, right? They will appoint um a quality reviewer, right? Then that's basically still talking about the audit team, right? The audit team. Now, what is this? Emphasize professional skepticism. So that's the level of skepticism. Decrease performance materiality. That's the level of skepticism, right? Place less reliance on audit evidence provided by management. That's professional skepticism, right? And then incorporate higher level of predictability. That's professional skepticism, right? And increase sample sizes. Why do you do all of these things? To increase the level of or enhance the level of professional skepticism. Yeah. So that's basically it for that one. And then when I move on to internal control. So for internal controls, before I move on to like internal controls, let me just go to controls, NJ, because this will cover all controls. As you can see, the one that I did here for computers, this was also controls, but these were for general controls, right? This is for internal controls. This is for all controls. So it doesn't matter if, like, let's say you are dealing with application controls, maybe here you're just gonna put application controls. You have to have the list of recommended practice for the application control. But let me just start with this one. So for controls, what must you have? And this one, obviously, this goes for the rest. That's the right. This goes for also like questions in the payroll cycle because they deal basically with controls there most of the times. So how do you do controls, right? So for controls, like any other control, you have to have the recommended like list, the recommended practice of controls. Because like I said, you can't identify like a weakness in a control if you don't know like what that control should be. Because a weakness is basically if it's not in accordance with that recommended practice. So if you do not know the recommended practice, then you will not know the weakness, right? So let me give you an example. So let's go to, yeah, this one, right? So weakness, timesheets are not reviewed by foremen, but by payroll staff, right? Payroll staff would probably not know how many hours the employee spent at work. Okay, the employee was paid more than she was actually supposed to be paid, right? So what's the weakness here, right? Right. So they say timesheets are not reviewed by the foreman, right? Do you see that? Like I said, a weakness is something that doesn't go according to the recommended practice, and the recommended practice is the control, right? So what is this thing here? What is this question? Yeah, what is this thing here? That's the recommended practice. That's the control, right? So that's where you get your recommended practices and controls, right? So in this case, the foreman should keep what a record of personal, yeah, a record of personal present and time worked, right? So that's the control. In some questions, they ask you to give the risk, not the control, right? The risk, right? Yeah. And then the risk, you're just gonna put the impact of not putting a foreman here, right? And then, um, so like I said, these weaknesses are weaknesses because it didn't follow this recommended practice. So what's more important? The most important thing for you guys to have is these recommended practices. So everywhere where I have recommended practice, I suggest you have like some sort of like list of it, right? So if you don't have like the list right now, like I said, I will like give you like a comprehensive list for the next test. But if you do not have a list right now, I suggest you go to at least like one of each like topic and then go to the like I did show you like for like all topics how you get the recommended practice list because that list is the most important. Once you have that list, it's just a matter of following the framework, right? And then it will give you the answer exactly, right? And then, like I said, the control is the what in the recommended practice list. So the control is exactly what's here in the first place, right? And then the weakness is the impact of the risk, right? So it'll work the same way, even for internal controls. It's just that the environment is not the same, right? Yeah. And then test of controls, right? So we're gonna do like what are these what must you do when they say test the control, right? So the first thing, the first part is obviously you have to get the control, identify the control, right? Because for you to test it, you have to see what control it is first. So I didn't really put that as a point here because like that's obvious. For you to test value control, you have to identify it first, right? And then after you identify the control, you have to look at the objective of the control. So what was the control used for, right? You know, a control does one of three things, right? It prevents, detects, or corrects misstatements, right? So you're gonna see what does that control do? Does it prevent, does it detect, or does it correct misstatements, right? And then right? Depending on what it does, you're gonna try to break the control. So if it prevents misstatements, right? You're gonna try to make a misstatement and see whether that control does prevent that misstatement, right? And then to detect it, your same thing, you're gonna do a misstatement and then see does it detect the misstatement, right? And then correct, you're gonna do a misstatement and see if it corrects the misstatement, right? or so you'll see that's the first type of test of control, right? They will try to break the control. Or this is the second part they can do. So they can do this or they can do this. Check for evidence that the that okay there is not really specific that the client, right? Yeah, that the client, right? Yeah, that the client, Yeah, that the client is implementing the control, right? So these are like if maybe a control, for instance, like a usual control for computers, right, is that like exception reports must be reviewed, right? So that's a control. Exception report must be reviewed by that manager, right? So for that type, in most cases, like I said, like either you try to break or check for like evidence, right? So in most cases, when the control like is signing or yeah, signing a document or something, then you're just gonna look for evidence, like in this one that I told you about. So um the exception reports basically must be signed, must be reviewed by the manager, right? And how are they reviewed by the manager? So with that type of control, you test it by checking, right? Checking that really the manager did like review the like did review the exception report, right? And how do you check whether he reviewed the exception report? You're gonna check for his signature, right? Because he has to sign it off. So that's what I mean when I say check for evidence. Yeah. So this was basically like I said, a very like short like video just to cover like what we did like in class, and give you like an overview on how you should like approach like these questions. Yeah, I hope it helped.